we imagine it as a tube like that with closed ends, what happens is it elongates and the walls thicken and it curves and it becomes the brain and spinal cord. So there's your spinal cord, there's your brain stem, and you've got your midbrain, and let's do a cerebral one of this. There's your corpus callosum. This would be your diencephalon. Okay. Anyway, on the inside of that, of course, you've got the remnants of that tube. Still exist in that. You've got the two lateral ventricles. You've got the narrow third ventricle, which runs through the diencephalon. The cerebral aqueduct. There's a fourth ventricle down here. Kind of opens up a little bit. I didn't draw the cerebellum, but it develops as a pouching of the back of the brainstem. And then you've got your long tube here, right? So my point in saying all this is that the spinal cord and brain are one structure. It's one thing. Okay? But of course, the brain is enclosed in the cranial cavity, and the spinal cord is enclosed in the vertebral cavity. The spinal cord consists mainly of fiber tracts that are going up and down, carrying sensory and motor information. And along its length, nerves form that then exit the vertebral column via the intervertebral foramina. You remember those formed by the articulating process of the vertebrae. Superior and inferior articulating processes join together, creating a hole underneath them called the intervertebral foramen, and that allows for the passage of the spinal nerves. Okay? These spinal nerves then give rise to peripheral nerves that, of course, course through the body and play motor and sensory function. Now, as I said in the video, when you watch it, you will learn that you have to know your 12 pairs of cranial nerves. You'll need to be able to identify them on drawings mainly and know their functions, right? Are they sensory and motor? If they're sensory, what senses do they carry? If they're motor, what muscles do they command? Of the muscles that were on our list, right? Not just any old muscle. So you have to know all 12 of the cranial nerves. Now, we're not asking you to learn every single peripheral nerve in the body. We have a select few. Okay, so as we go through this, we'll look at the structure of the spinal cord, and we'll look at some specific peripheral nerves that you need to be familiar with. Okay, so here we can see the spinal cord exposed. This model shows it as well. In fact, this is sold as a model of the nervous system. It generally tapers as you go down. It's usually thicker on the superior end and thinner on the inferior end. And this is not surprising if you think about its function. It's carrying motor and sensory fibers. It's collecting sensory information as it goes up, so it needs more room to hold more information. It's carrying information, motor information down, so as that motor information leaves to go command the muscles, you need less room, right? So it tapers. So a couple places where it kind of breaks that rule though. Right at the base of the neck, you have a cervical enlargement. At the bottom of the spinal cord, you have the lumbar enlargement. Okay? And that's because there's a lot of information going in and out right there because of the limbs. You got all the information going in and out from the arms there, and from the upper limbs there, and from the lower limbs there. Now notice the spinal cord does not go all the way to the bottom of the vertebral cavity. It terminates right at the top of the lumbar vertebrae, right? And it ends in a tapering structure known as the conus medullaris. You can see it here, this tapering cone. And coming off the sides of that cone, you have nerves that continue to travel within the vertebral cavity and exit further down via the intervertebral foramina of the lumbar vertebrae and the sacral and coccygeal vertebrae. Okay? But they emerge from the spinal cord here. This cluster of nerves was thought to resemble the tail of a horse. And so this is called the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. Now, what I've handed out to you are models of cross sections of the cervical spine. And if we look at that, we can see a few features here. First of all, in this cross section, you'll notice that the pattern of gray and white matter in the spine is opposite to that we see in the cerebrum and the cerebellum. It's white matter on the outside, and then this butterfly-shaped region of gray matter on the inside. Okay? So what this white matter is are columns of fibers going up and down, carrying sensory and motor information. And the gray matter is cell bodies, neurons that have their cell bodies and dendrites within the spinal cord, but also tracts of unmyelinated fibers are there. Okay. Now, there's some surface features we can note about the spinal cord. It's got sulci as well, gyri. You've got a posterior median sulcus on the back. But on the anterior or the ventral side, there's a fissure. It goes almost all the way to the middle. Anterior median fissure. And so we have that bilateral symmetry, just like we do in every other part of the human body. Except for the digestive system. All right? Now, the brain, the spinal cord is surrounded by meninges. In fact, they're the same layers. Again, this is one structure. And one way you can define the central nervous system is that these are the structures surrounded by meninges. Okay, so we have the dura mater here, and then it's kind of hard to see in this model, but there's the arachnoid mater underneath it. And then there's a space beneath that, the subarachnoid space. And the spinal cord is floating in that space. Okay? It needs a bit more reinforcement than the brain because the space it's floating in is moving around. And so these lateral little extensions of the pia mater. You can see them here. Not labeled on there, but they're called denticulate ligaments. But they're where the pia mater has come out to the surface, come out to the dura, and kind of hold it laterally. And then there's one on your list here. It comes right off the peak of the conus medullaris and goes all the way down to the floor of the vertebral column. It's called the filium terminale. That's an extension of the pia mater that goes all the way down and basically helps stabilize the spinal cord vertically. So when you're looking at this model and you see this labeled thing in the middle, it's going from the peak there all the way down. That's not a nerve. It's the filium terminale. Again, we have the white matter columns and the gray matter, and these are named by their position. Latin for column is funiculus. Okay, so you have the posterior column or posterior funiculus, also called the dorsal column. Remember, dorsal's back, ventral is stomach. And you see these terms used a lot more in the spinal cord or in the nervous system than elsewhere. But the dorsal column or posterior column, posterior funiculus is here. Then you have the lateral column on the side or lateral funiculus. And then the anterior or ventral column here. Similarly, you have these names for the gray matter. Right, again, it's this butterfly-shaped gray matter. And the different points of the wings of the butterfly are called the horns. You've got the dorsal horn or posterior horn, the ventral horn or anterior horn, and then in most of the spinal cord you'll have a lateral horn as well, sticking out the side. Okay. And then the two halves of the gray matter, two halves of the butterfly are connected across the midline to the gray commissure. Remember, commissures across the midline. And right in the middle of that is that central canal, that remnant of that original tube in the spinal cord. There's also a white commissure on both sides, crosses the midline. That would be myelinated fibers crossing, whereas the gray commissure is unmyelinated. Now, if you look at this cross section, you can see all those parts again. There's your dorsal column, your lateral, your ventral. But in this one, what they've done is labeled them to show you the nature of the information that's traveling in each of those. In blue, we have ascending or sensory tracts. Those are tracts carrying sensory information. And in red, we have descending or motor tracts carrying motor information. And what you'll notice is the dorsal column is entirely sensory, 100%. And then if we turn down to the anterior column, you see it's mostly motor tracts. And that's a trend we can identify in the spinal cord. The dorsal posterior side is sensory. The ventral or anterior side is motor. And the lateral, as we see, is mixed. The anterior is mixed as well, but this one's more mixed. This also carries into the gray matter. The ventral horn of the gray matter has motor neurons in it. That's where the motor neurons live that innervate your muscles, unless they're muscles in the face or something, and then they live in the motor nuclei in the brainstem. Okay, and then the dorsal column or dorsal gray matter is our dorsal or posterior gray matter. That dorsal horn is sensory neurons. All right, now the spinal nerves emerge from the spinal cord along its length. The portion giving rise to each nerve is considered a segment, and you can see the circuits are arranged segmentally like that. Again, we are all kind of centipedes on the inside. We have this segmental body arrangement. Okay. So each nerve arises from two roots. You have a dorsal root. It's coming out the dorsal or posterior side. Notice it initially arises from small ones called rootlets. Those join together to form the dorsal root. And then you have this ventral rootlets, which join to form the ventral root. Those then join together to form the spinal nerve. Okay. The dorsal root contains 100% sensory fibers. The ventral root contains 100% motor fibers. So this is all information going in. This is all information going out. Once they come together, they form the spinal nerve. It's mixed sensory motor. Now, when you learn about the cranial nerves, as I know you all do this weekend, you will find that some cranial nerves are purely sensory. There are others that are mostly motor. There's no such thing as purely motor, because if you send commands to a muscle, you carry proprioception back from the muscle. Right? Remember, proprioception helps you tell which muscles are contracted in their position. Okay? So it's mostly motor, but not purely motor. But we do have purely sensory cranial nerves. There are no pure spinal nerves. They're all mixed. Okay. All right, now, if we look at the details of that dorsal root, you'll notice it has a swelling on it there. The dorsal root ganglion. A ganglion, if you recall, is a cluster of nerve cells that live outside the central nervous system. Most neurons have their cell bodies inside the central nervous system, either spread over a surface, which we call the cortex, or located in clusters deep within the central nervous system tissue. We call those nuclei. But outside the central nervous system, you'll have clusters as well, and these are called ganglia. Okay. Now, when we talked about the types of neurons, the shapes that neurons can have, one I mentioned was this unipolar or pseudo-unipolar neurons that have the cell body kind of sticking off the side. Right? Those are your sensory neurons, and in fact, it is in those dorsal root ganglia, that's where you find those cell bodies. Right? So that swelling in the dorsal root ganglion is where we have the cell bodies of those sensory neurons. They're called the first order sensory neurons because they are carrying the information in from sensory receptors. Right? So one end would be sensory receptors in the skin, the other would be tracts or terminals in the central nervous system. And so they're the first order one. We also see here how the lower motor neurons are located in the ventral gray matter, the ventral horn. And they go out the ventral root to the spinal nerve. Okay. Right, now if we look at how the spinal nerves are laid out, we can see that segmental arrangement again. And I first want us to look at the thoracic region. There are 12 pairs of thoracic spinal nerves, 8 pairs of cranials,